Entrepreneurial, leadership, intellectual. This is the Cultural Connections Podcast.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Holmes, and I am the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Today, before I introduce our guest today on the podcast, I want to remind all of our viewers at home that we are recording this episode live on Monday, August 5th, 2024. And we are recording today's episode live on YouTube. We're changing it up a little bit here and seeing how people respond with watching on YouTube. So that means if you have a question for our guest today, please feel free to comment below with your question, and we will be sure to answer them live on the podcast. Also, news with today's episode as well. For those that are not watching live, but necessarily either likely listening to this podcast after the initial live, this likely could be our first potential live episode on iHeartRadio. So if you are an iHeartRadio listener, and welcome to the Cultural Connections podcast, our newest platform that we're able to get our podcast onto. Today's episode, we have a returning guest on the podcast, someone who is familiar to all of you, and we're talking about an election this year. And no, we're not talking about the election that I think that is on the forefront of everyone's mind, meaning the presidential election. We're not going to be discussing that during the next half hour to 45 minutes, but it's another election here in the state of Massachusetts for make candidates for state rep. And we are joined today by returning guest Amy Sangiolo. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for having me.
Thank you again. Well, before we go any further, I would like you again just to reintroduce yourself to our viewers and tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So my name is Amy Mah Sangiolo. I'm a former city councilor. I served on the Newton City Council for 20 years. I'm currently working at the Attorney General's office in housing. So I help prevent evictions and foreclosures through mediation and direct many individuals and families who are in need of assistance to agencies that can provide that help. I'm running because Kay Khan, who's been our state rep for about 29 to 30 years, has decided to retire. She's been fabulous. She's led on so many different issues, whether it's ending child marriage or banning conversion therapy, or even making sure that we had reforms in our criminal justice system. She's been a real leader, and I hope to follow in her footsteps and continue on her legacy.
Well, that's fantastic. And that jumps into my immediate first question here is let's talk about the race for state representative. I asked you a lot of really similar questions the last time we were on with a different race, but we're going to go along the same lines here. And I'm going to start off with the most type of common question to ask is, and that is, what makes you uniquely qualified for this position?
Sure. I think there are several reasons that make me uniquely qualified. So one, it's the deep experience that I have in getting things done in the legislative process. As I mentioned at the outset, I served on the Newton City Council, and then before it was even City Council, it was called the Board of Aldermen. I served for 20 years. I was elected vice president of the City Council for 2 terms. I led on many issues, whether it's protecting open space, protecting our trees, getting more affordable housing and more conditions from our developers in terms of development projects. I've got a proven track record in providing excellent constituent services. I definitely developed a reputation for being accessible and responsive. And I do the same type of work in my day job at the Attorney General's office. And finally, I think I've shown a real commitment to good communication and transparency in government. Back in 2015, many people know that I started a newsletter. It was an e-newsletter to make sure that folks knew what their city government was up to. And that eventually led to co-founding Fig City News, which has become a widely read news source for the city. So I'm all about uh, leading on issues through the legislative process, providing excellent constituent service, and being very good at transparency and good communication to the residents of Newton.
I think that's greatly important. Absolutely. My next question to you is this particular race, you uniquely have the fact that not only will you be having your primary coming up in September, where you have an opponent, but there's also a Republican challenge that you'll be facing come November. And I'm going to say from both of these candidates, because we have to get through the primary first, what makes you stand out different from your opponent come September?
Oh, for the primary. So for the primary, I think the difference is experience, certainly.
Yeah.
Like I said, deep experience in getting things done through the legislative process. I've worked with this community for the 30 years that I've lived here, whether working with PTO organizations and school organizations, athletic organizations, while my kids were growing up here and attending the Newton Public Schools, through working with music organizations, cultural organizations, uh, organizations like the Boys and Girls Club, throughout my time here in Newton. So I've got these deep roots here. I've shown that even after I left public office, I stayed involved and engaged. And I think that really is what sets me apart. In addition, I intend to be a full-time representative at the State House. And I think it's important considering all the challenges that we face, the climate challenge, the housing shortage challenge, the lack of enough funding for our education and our transit system. All of these challenges require a full-time legislator to give it full-time attention.
Absolutely, I would 100% agree on that. Again, I want to just remind our viewers at home that are just tuning in with us that we are live here on the Cultural Connections podcast. We are live on Monday, August 5th, and we are live today on YouTube. Therefore, if you have a question for our guest, and today we are joined by Amy Sangiolo, candidate for Massachusetts State Representative. Please feel free to comment below here on YouTube, and we'll do our best to answer your questions during the live podcast here. My next question then brings us to hear about the different issues that you obviously are. Those are the big, your top issues for being a candidate and what you would do. I'm going to go through the list here according to what's here, obviously here on your campaign website. And for those that also want to learn more about Amy Sangiolo, you can visit her campaign website, sangioloforstaterep.org. So let's start here with the first one on the list, and that is climate. Let's talk about what your plan as an elected state legislator, what you would do to help the climate.
Sure. So I have deep experience in environmental advocacy and policy. I began my career, I think, with the Sierra Club Legal Defense and Education Fund out in San Francisco, working on legislation to protect our endangered species. I continued working with Senator Kerry's office through the National Wildlife Federation to get his flood insurance reform bill passed. So I've got deep experience in that process. Also, the Container Recycling Institute, tracking and advocating for bottle bill legislation throughout the country. So these are issues that we are facing here in the state as well. Certainly, I'm disappointed that the climate bill didn't get passed through before the end of the current legislative session. I'm hoping to move that forward. I believe in a lot of the issues and policy measures that were placed in that bill, including getting us off of gas, not expanding our gas infrastructure so that we can stop spending millions of dollars replacing these gas lines and instead use that money to transition off of gas. I think that we have to take into consideration our marginalized communities and make sure that they have a say in local siting decisions as well for all these clean energy sources that we'd like to place here in the Commonwealth. So those are some of the few things that I'd like to lead on as well. I also want to do a shout out for the bottle bill because I think that it's been such a long time since we initially passed it, and we definitely need to expand it.
Absolutely. I understand what you're saying there. My next question, then, let's continue down the list here. You touched upon it a little bit, and that is housing. Housing, as everyone knows here in the state of Massachusetts, specifically, but it's not just here, it's almost everywhere. But specifically, we're focused here in Massachusetts is really the housing crisis almost in a way, and how making, especially in communities like Newton, more affordable. What is your plan as a state legislator to tackle on housing?
Sure. So I believe housing is a human right, and everybody has the right to have access to affordable, safe, and habitable housing that is accessible for everyone. So my day job at the Attorney General's office really informs me about the situation that's out there, right? We don't have truly affordable housing or enough of it. Certainly, we need to increase our supply of housing at all income levels. We're certainly seeing a lot of luxury housing being produced here in Newton, which is not really accessible for many of our young folks and also our older folks who are looking to downsize. So I think what we need to do is be more intentional. So direct our resources. The housing bond bill that's before the governor to be signed shortly. I think that is a great start in terms of putting money towards not only preserving our existing housing stock, our public housing stock, but also making sure that we have enough funds to spur on more development, to help developers provide provide housing at all income levels. But I really do believe that the need out there is for truly affordable housing. We're seeing an increase in our homelessness, and we definitely do need to do more in terms of helping them. I also want to say that I really think that government should play a much more active role in creating housing. I've been a supporter of that when I was on the city council. I think to the extent that the cities and towns can get that real estate transfer fee, put some funding in their affordable housing trust funds, purchase existing properties, and even go and develop properties for truly affordable housing. I think that's what we need to do.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense, definitely. And again, I just want to remind our viewers that are tuning into us with us just now. We are live here on the Cultural Connections podcast. It is Monday, August 5th, 2024. And we have our returning guest, Amy Sangiolo, candidate for state representative with us. So if you have a question and you're watching live here on YouTube with us, please feel free to comment below. We're monitoring the YouTube feed while we're live, and we will be glad to ask your questions live during the podcast. My next thing then here is that your next issue here you have listed is public transportation. And here in the Bay State of Massachusetts, anyone who knows anything about the public transportation system here in Massachusetts, it's that it's usually it usually is a daily headline on the news about something that went wrong with the green line, the blue line, the red line. There's always something that seems to go wrong every single day. And maybe one of these days we'll finally get the system working like a normal transit system. Is that possible? And what would be your priorities of fixing our public transportation system here in the state?
Right. I do think it's possible. I think it'll take a long time. I think our Phil Ang has certainly been making improvements for all the lines to try to get rid of some of these slow zones and to improve them. I think I want to carry on KCON's tradition and her advocacy fighting for accessible commuter rail stations so that we can increase ridership. I think if they're not accessible, you can't get people riding them. You need them to be more frequent, and you need them to be more reliable. Putting funding into a system without oversight, I think, is also an issue that I'd like to look at. I want to make sure that the funds are directed to, again, making these types of improvements. It might take a big overhaul of the system, but we're going to have to do it. I think also tied in with that is when we're looking at like expansion of our roadways or redoing our roadways, like the I-90 Alston project. I think it's a real mistake to continue to have 12 lanes of highway, not have an express bus lane. I think we should have that. I think we should reduce the lanes if we're going to redo that highway system so that we encourage people to get on public transit. But that's a hard sell, right? Unless you have good public transit, it's hard to tell people, well, we're going to limit your ability to get in. We're going to make it harder. No, I don't want to do that. I really want both. I want to get people more on public transit as possible so that we can help curb pollution, so we can, get people safely and affordably in and out of their workplaces.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. I think it is something we definitely need some improvement as time goes on. The next one here, as many here in, is education. And education is a topic here in Newton that I think many who have followed along know, especially this past year, that was a rocky topic here in Newton for a very extended period of time where we watched students out of school for a little, I think it was close to around 2 weeks, if not maybe a little bit more than that, because of the Newton strike. And it was something I think that people saw unprecedented. And there was a lot of this bickering back and forth on who's at fault and how do we really move forward as a community from this. Let's talk about education as a whole at first, and then I'll dive deep into that second. Talk about education. What are your priorities as education for the state and helping our community?
Sure. I mean, if anything, COVID really showed the disparities and really highlighted the need that our students have in terms of more resources available, not just for academic, but also for social emotional learning, as well as mental health supports. And I believe that that's what our teachers were fighting for. It wasn't just about wages, but it was about getting the resources needed for the kids that they work with every single day. Right. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to tackle the process? So funding obviously is an issue that communities in Massachusetts face everywhere, right? You see almost every year another community is asking for an override, right, to supplement the funding because not enough revenue is being generated in order to fund our schools. So we got to look at, the way we fund our educational system. Maybe it's relooking at the funding formula. Maybe it's looking at other grants and other resources. Maybe it's going to the federal government to advocate to give us more funding for our schools, right? Communities all believe that education is a priority. But how we do it, how we fund it is really critical. And to the extent that I can be there to advocate not only for the teachers, but also for the children who really do need the resources, I will do that. And I will be a real partner for the cities and towns who struggle to get those revenues.
Absolutely. I think that's great to hear that. I think then I touch upon the second part here as in which I began with, and that was about the fact that Newton was rocked by a teacher strike that really lost a lot of confidence in our elected officials because of what had happened. And it was unprecedented. There was a lot of blame on both sides, a lot of people really not sure people who once thought of the Newton Public Schools as the greatest school system, one of the greatest school systems around, starting to think, is this really the greatest school system around, considering everything that's going on? And how do we make sure that something like this doesn't happen again, where students are taken out of school for an extended period of time because the teachers union and the city cannot reach an agreement on a contract?
Sure. Well, you know that I ran for mayor a few years
Yes.
ago, and I saw that the city was about to face some really tight financial difficulties, right? We did have a lot of free cash and other one-time spending that was available. I can't be like the what's it called, armchair quarterback, and say that things would be different, but I can say that we need to avoid situations like that, right? We need to make sure that everything is on the table, that everybody negotiates fairly in good faith, to avoid any future type of striking situation, right? Everybody is in favor of getting more resources to our teachers and to our students. It's a question of what the city's ability and what the city's priorities are.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree further on that. And again, I just want to remind people tuning in, if you are just watching right now, We are live here on the Cultural Connections podcast. It's Monday, August 5th, 2024, and we are live here on YouTube with Amy Sangiolo, candidate for state representative. So my next question, we're going down the list here of the issues that are listed here on your website, your campaign website, and the next one is, I believe, I'm going to go back to the website here if I can, is building a strong economy. Let's talk about that. The economy, we've always seen as its ups and downs and trying to really build back Massachusetts stronger than ever. What is your plan for tackling and building a stronger economy for the state of Massachusetts?
Sure. So that's another bill that I was disappointed didn't move past the legislature for before the end of their legislative session or the formal session. I really do support all the stuff that Governor Healy had placed in the bill, including making strategic investments in our life sciences industries as well as climate tech, right? I think we have to do that. Those are two industries that will make Massachusetts a global leader. To the extent possible, we need to get that moving. And if it doesn't get passed by before the end of this term, I hope to take a lead on that effort. I think what we also have to do is make sure that we create an atmosphere where it's a business friendly climate, right? I think it's really important that we look at all the regulations that we impose on businesses to make sure that they're not overburdensome. And when we know that they're going to be extremely expensive investments they have to make, for example, to get off of fossil fuels, right? We need to make sure that the state and federal government are real partners to them to make sure that they have the resources and any type of financial and technical assistance that they need in order to comply with those regulations that we may be imposing on them. I think what's also important is that we recognize how much our arts and cultural organizations and how much it is an important driver for our economy here in Massachusetts. And I think more investments need to go to that sector as well. I support having a percentage of our budget to go towards the arts and culture sectors. And whatever we can do to support that effort, I would also advocate for. In addition, here in Newton, more specifically, I do support creating that Washington Street corridor as a cultural district. I think that would be great for Newton, and any way that I can help make that happen, I'm happy to work with folks here in Newton to get that done.
I think that's great to hear. And then the last one here on your campaign website is local funding. Let's talk about how you would bring in local funding to our great city of Newton here. What would be your priorities and ways of tackling that?
Sure. I mean, KCON has been great. So has Ruth Balzer in making sure that our organizations have the resources they need for whatever grant funding that for projects that they have, whether it's to create some parks and more open space or to help provide funding for the Gath Pool. I mean, KCON got $400,000 to help with the Gath Pool and was recognized for that because she did a great job in helping to alleviate the cost in order to get that upgraded. And it's a gem, right? So I would, because I have more than 30 years or about 30 years of experience working with organizations, for profit and nonprofit here in Newton, I believe that I have that connection to understand and work with them to find out what their needs are to ensure that we advocate and see what grant funding or earmarks we can get from the legislature to fund those projects here in Newton.
I think that's great. I think that's also very important. My next question then to you is along the lines is let's say for all intents and purposes you are elected and on day one, what would you say would be your most top priority issue of all of these issues and how would you go about tackling that issue on day one?
So I guess if I'm elected on day one, the first thing I want to do is move forward the climate bill if it hasn't already moved. So get that moving, make sure that we actually start addressing the climate crisis that we have and getting a lot of those policy initiatives funded and moving forward. So that would probably be my first priority. I have to say though, a close second would be really digging deep in understanding the legislative process and how things move or don't move through the process. It's frustrating as someone on the outside looking in. And whatever I can do to make it a little more transparent, I will do that.
I think that's great. I think that's extremely important. Well, we just the last few minutes we have left here on the podcast. It's hard to believe we're already reaching towards the end. Again, I just want to say one last time that if you are just tuning in, we are live here on the Cultural Connections podcast. It is Monday, August 5th, 2024, and we are live here on YouTube with candidate for state representative in Massachusetts, Amy Sangiolo. So my last really question for you, as we start to wrap up, is for any type of appeal to voters that you would like to give, and again, how they can find out, obviously, more information about you. I mentioned the website once, but you can mention it again, and anything else that you want to as well to appeal to the voters.
Sure. No, I thank you again for the time to appear on your podcast. It's great always talking to you about different issues and about my candidacy. Again, I believe I'm the best candidate for this position. I've got years of deep experience in getting things done in the legislative process, a real proven commitment of delivering excellent constituent service, and also a proven track record of good communication and transparency. I was a real partner at City Hall, and I will be a real partner to the city and to the residents of the city at the State House. You can go to my website, www.sangioloforstaterep.org. You can reach me on that website through email or by phone. And as I tell people while I'm knocking on doors, and I think my team and I have hit about 6,000 plus doors already. I tell people, if you haven't already made up your mind or you have a question you want to ask me, reach out to me and I will circle back to where you are so that we can have an in-depth discussion about whatever issue you'd like.
Absolutely. I think that's great. And I will also just point out there to voters too, that if they're ever looking to try to find you, likely on a Tuesday, the Newton Farmers Market, if it's not a rainy day like it's supposed to be tomorrow, that's another likely spot where you can be found out there. And I can attest to the fact when I walked by that you're often been surrounded by people trying to ask you questions. So you definitely are a top target there. But again, I want to thank you again for joining me today on the Cultural Connections podcast. This has been a great and another informative episode. And I want to remind our viewers at home, if you have a question or a comment that you would have liked answered during the podcast, please feel free to contact me directly and I'll still get your questions answered and forward them along so we can get you the answers that you are looking for. You can reach me via email at brianives@gmail.com. That's BRIANIVS@gmail.com. In addition, if you have suggestions for future episodes of the podcast, you can also email me with that same email address. With that said, I want to thank you, Amy, again for joining me here on the Cultural Connections podcast. It's been great. We wish you luck in September and again in November as the election moves forward. And we thank everyone for watching from at home. And thank you again for watching the Cultural Connections podcast. I'm Brian Ives, and I'm the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast. For more information on today's episode, be sure to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also watch this episode again in its entirety on our YouTube channel. This podcast is also available on listening platforms Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Breaker, Radio Public, and New TV. Thanks again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast.
And one